Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we're going to be discussing Palestine's Liberation Organization decisions on Israel must be implemented. Joining us on the show is Sharif Nashashibi, an award-winning journalist and analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. When we're to look at the elections which took place, how did people react to when Benjamin Netanyahu won?
There was two very distinct reactions. There was kind of outrage that he was expected to lose the election. He came through at the last minute, based on racist comments, on rejecting any Palestinian state, and he won. So there was a lot of outrage that it was that kind of belligerence and racism that won him the election. But then there was another current that was saying, well, you know what? This is good for the Palestinians because now he's shown his true colors, and Israel is going to be more isolated internationally because you have a leader such as him who is, the fact that he is so belligerent not just with the Palestinians but in terms of his own allies as well. The fact that he says and does the things he does, helps the Palestinian cause because it makes Israel's PR campaign a disaster. So there were two very distinct things, that things are going to get worse for the Palestinians because he's back in power, or that actually it will serve them well because if there was, let's say, a leftist or centrist government that was headed by someone who's proclaimed as a dove, then the world would give Israel the benefit of the doubt that it doesn't deserve.
So can we categorize the Benjamin Netanyahu's campaign as racist?
Of course. I mean, look, the irony is that this campaign, for the most part, was portrayed as something that was to do with domestic issues, that it didn't really have much to do with the Palestinian issue. But what won him that election were two things. It was saying explicitly that there will be no Palestinian state under my watch, and the claim that leftist groups were busing Arab voters in droves to vote, and that the rule of the right was in jeopardy. That's what won him the election. So it was an undeniably racist comment and an explicit rejection of a Palestinian state that won him that election. And his attempts afterwards to reverse these things and to placate his critics and even his allies are really laughable. It's really been a joke how he's trying to go on about it.
But then with that, can we actually say that the Palestinians have more of the higher power in the sense that they can use Benjamin Netanyahu's statements against Israel, and that's how Palestine can actually be formed as a state?
Well, certainly what benefits the Palestinians, if you look, that in terms of substance, there's no difference between left and right in Israel. It's a difference of style, not of substance. And the problem with leftist and centrist governments is that they're given the benefit of the doubt. The world sees them as more dovish, whereas actually their policies are the same. They just say the right things to appease the international community. So in a sense, right-wing governments they favor Palestinians in the sense that there's no pretense. They're very explicit about their opinions. They constantly create their own PR disasters. When you have, for instance, the foreign minister, saying that disloyal Arabs should be beheaded. How do you explain this away? They put their own foot in their mouths. They say and do things that are indefensible. Whereas, for example, in this last election, the Zionist Union, which was the main opponent, the challenger of Netanyahu, one of the two leaders was Tzipi Livni, who again is portrayed as some kind of dove. When look what she did under her tenure in office. She's no different. So this is the thing. I think people have come to realize that right-wing governments are no different. The only difference is they are much more explicit in their intentions, and that ultimately hurts Israel's narrative and increases its isolation.
As there isn't a difference between the right and left wing, can we say there's a point for the Arabs that are living in Israel? Is there a point for them to actually vote, as there isn't any difference between the campaigns and the parties?
It's a difficult dilemma. This is a very general dilemma of disenfranchised communities anywhere in the world. If you have an unjust system, do you participate in that system and try and change it from within? Or do you boycott it and say, we cannot legitimize the system by taking part in it and we have to challenge it from outside? I understand arguments on both sides. It's a very difficult situation. So I don't take a specific stand on this. I think each person should decide for themselves whether they feel that they should or they shouldn't take part. But certainly Arab turnout in this election was higher. There are more Arab seats now. I mean, the Arab bloc is now the third largest bloc in Israel's parliament. So, you can see that there is the ability perhaps in the future to, if this continues, that there would be a minority that would be harder and harder to ignore. But my worry is that people would come out to vote hoping that they can make a difference, and then when this bloc is completely ignored, when any Israeli government refuses to have them as part of it, when they're ignored in parliament, when the Arab community continues to be discriminated against, I worry that these people who have become energized to take part will become even more hopeless than they were before. That, look, we made an effort and look where it got us. That's what I worry about in the future. So, but I think eventually, it might not happen soon, but eventually the Arab population of Israel will grow to the point, not just in terms of demographically, but in terms of political power, where you can't ignore it. It would be an elephant in the room that you can't ignore. I think we're headed in that direction.
But then when we're to look at it previously and throughout the years that the Arabs actually have been taking part in the Israeli government, have they actually...
No, they've never taken part in the Israeli government. No Israeli government has ever included an Arab party. Categorically.
But haven't there ever been MPs within the Arab MPs within the Israeli government?
No, there have been token Arabs in Israeli governments, but there have not been MPs from the Arab parties. So
this is the big change that's actually happened now.
Well, there's no big. There's no. Arab parties are not being invited into government. So that in that sense, it hasn't changed. What's changed is that these Arab parties decided to come together to have a greater impact in parliament and hopefully on the ground. So yet to see whether there will be an impact. We have to see even whether this united list will how much longevity it has. But it was a way really of getting around electoral laws that were designed to limit Arab participation. Even the existence of Arab parties in parliament was in doubt. So I think this was a necessary and pragmatic move on these parties to say, look, we can't. It'll be hard for us to survive individually. We have to come together. This galvanized Arab voters. They wanted a unified list. They wanted to see unity among their community. And this resulted in more seats in parliament. So yes, these are improvements, but people also have to see a corresponding improvement in their own lives that is created by this greater level of participation and influence, and that we have yet to see.
But then, as Netanyahu is very open when he's to criticize or speak racist words about the Palestinians, do you think that the Arab Israelis are going to actually have the opportunity like any other citizen there?
Well, I think eventually. I mean, look, if for example, I think by the year 2025, which is not that far away, it's 10 years away, that they are going to be about a quarter of the population. Eventually, demographically, they are going to be a larger and larger minority that you can't ignore. I mean, it simply isn't going to be that way. And I think now you're seeing attempts, particularly by the Israeli right wing, to force legislation that makes the situation of Arabs more precarious in Israel, because they want these people to leave. They realize that they're going to be a constituency that they can't ignore, so they want them to leave. So I think this is a recognition by the Israeli right of that. But it's you can't expel wholesale this community, and they are adamant that they will not be uprooted again. So I think eventually Israel is going to have to come to a reckoning that they can't ignore them forever.
As Netanyahu said that there are going to be more settlements in Palestine, what's the situation going to actually be there?
Well, the irony of these Israeli prime ministers who push this settlement expansion is that they are inadvertently the biggest proponents of the one-state solution. because they have now made a two-state solution all but impossible. There are too many settlers and too many settlements dotted all over Palestine to be separated. You wouldn't be able to remove all of them. Look at the uproar that took place over the removal of several thousand from Gaza. You're talking several 100,000 in the West Bank. There is not the will to remove them, and even if there was the will, there would not be the ability. So now these people, Ariel Sharon, Netanyahu, these people, they are inadvertently the biggest proponents of the one-state solution, because they have basically on the ground made it impossible for a viable Palestinian state to come around.
So with the one-state solution, do you think, because this is the problem that we're always faced with, we're always told two-state solution, one-state solution, but now, as we can see, the two-state solution can never actually work. So with the one-state solution, as the government itself is saying that it is a Jewish state only, so there is no question for Muslims or Christians, what's going to actually happen then? Like, where are the Palestinian Muslims?
Well, the one state that Israel, if Israel doesn't want a Palestinian state to be created, it wants one state where it holds supremacy over the Palestinians. But I don't think that's possible. You have, if you look at Israel and the occupied territories together, there is numerical parity between them. And very soon, the Arabs will be a majority. So it cannot hope to have a situation like in South Africa, where a minority holds sway over the majority. The same thing happened in India. I mean, that's not tenable in the long run. But I think these Israeli leaders are so myopic in terms of fulfilling the Zionist agenda of colonizing the land that they think is theirs, that they haven't stopped to think, well, actually now we can't separate ourselves, and if they think that they can forcibly rule over a people within one territory who are in a majority, that's not going to happen. So I think there will come a time, and it could happen fairly soon, where the Palestinian national movement will say, okay, you know what? Since we can't have a viable state, then we want to be equal citizens. And at that point, Israel is going to have a completely different battle to fight. And it's going to be extremely difficult to deny people the right of citizenship in this one territory. If Israel refuses to have a viable Palestinian state, and then also refuses to give people in that territory equal rights, then what? I mean, it becomes.
But isn't that already happening though? Like in Israel, yes, there are Arab Israelis there, but they're not treated equally, just like the other Israelis there. So that is taking place currently.
Yes, but then you have a far greater number of Palestinians still within the general territory who are not citizens. So if you make them citizens, then that basically, in terms from the Israeli point of view, then it is no longer a Jewish state, and this is the big thing now. In recent years, I mean, initially it was about recognizing Israel. Once this no longer was an issue, then it had to be about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. So it is about keeping Israel as let's say a Jewish ethnocracy, where Jews have supremacy in that territory. But if you have a movement of Palestinians to say, right, well, if you're not going to give us our state, then give us citizenship. That's going to be a nightmare scenario from the point of view of an Israeli Zionist agenda. So, and I think now what you're seeing in recent years is a level of acceptance that the two-state solution is dead that you haven't seen before. Even people who, I mean, there are people who are always in favor of one state, but there are people who believed in two states now, and not just Palestinians, others who say, well, you know what? That dream is dead now. I mean, even if we want it to happen, it's not going to happen. So it's not, the debate now is not about whether two states is preferable, it's about whether it's possible. So you might not want one state, but you might come to think, well, okay, whether I want it or not,
it's not going to
how are we
happen,
going
and
to
it
get
can't
another
happen.
state? Exactly.
And that is the problem that they're faced with. But the thing is, with the polls that have been actually taking place, the youth mainly in Palestine believe that the one-state solution is the only way forward, because the two-state solution is dead.
Yes, you're having more popular support on the ground for this one-state solution, and importantly, as you said, it's coming from the youth, and they are the majority of the population in Palestine, and they are obviously the future of the Palestinian nation. So yeah, you are increasingly there is a level. Whereas before, the idea of a one-state solution was seen as this kind of naive, idealistic kind of.
Not just naive, but the people themselves, like especially the older generation who are actually leading the parties, they believe that's kind of like saying that they've lost and they've given victory all to Israel.
Well, there were various reasons why the movement for a one-state movement was really a movement of a minority, but that's growing. That minority is growing now, and as I said, it's more out of a realization rather than necessarily a genuine embracing of the one-state solution. To say, well, that's really practically on the ground the only game on the only situation that we can face with at the moment.
With Netanyahu's statement that they want to actually split Gaza up, and not just Gaza, Jerusalem, sorry. Do you think that the Christians there are going to allow it?
Netanyahu proposed to split Jerusalem? I don't think so. The Israeli leaders categorically refused to divide Jerusalem. So on what lines would they be splitting Jerusalem?
In the sense that the Jewish people can actually go there themselves and perform their religious supplications.
Well, I mean, Jews are not restricted from worship in Jerusalem. So, I mean, precisely
like to give them more rights to actually go there, because the Christians and the Muslims kind of are there more. So they want to give more rights to the actual,
I mean,
and especially in Al-Aqsa as well.
That's the thing. If you're talking about access to Jews of the Al-Aqsa compound, that's something that is that's an effort being made at the moment. But generally, in terms of Jewish access to worship in Jerusalem, there aren't restrictions. But yeah, in terms of access to the Al-Aqsa compound, that is something that's being pushed at the moment, and this would create massive tensions, not just in Jerusalem, but generally. This would be a regional and international issue, because it brings in all the major religions, and this would be seen as a major source of tension. I mean, if you look at the last Intifada, was sparked by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Al-Aqsa compound with security forces. I mean, that sparked the Intifada. So imagine that then you are allowing. It's not. You see, the reason why this is such a flashpoint is it's not an issue of Jews being allowed to pray on the compound. It's when you have more and more extremist Jews wanting to destroy the mosque. This is the problem: is that you're potentially inviting people who would want to either damage or destroy that mosque. It's a security issue. It's not a religious issue, and that's why people are so worried. That's why, in terms of the Waqf in Jerusalem, there is so much paranoia about allowing people access. Even, for instance, if you're a Muslim and you don't look Muslim, they're paranoid about allowing people in because of this very real risk of someone going in and destroying this mosque. There are a lot of extremist Israelis who publicly state that that's what they want, and to rebuild another temple. So this would be an extremely dangerous issue.
Speaking of security, the Palestinian Liberation Organization announced that they're going to be suspending the security there. How important is that statement?
It's hugely important because security coordination with Israel has always been a fundamental aspect of the Palestinian Authority's relationship with Israel since its creation. And this has been a source of so much anger from the Palestinians. And it's something, for example, not that long ago, Mahmoud Abbas described this coordination as sacred. That's the word he used. So for the PLO, which is the parent body of the PA, to say that they were cutting security coordination is extremely important. Unfortunately, though, since that decision was made, there hasn't been any actual change on the ground. Officials on both sides have said that so far it's still business as usual. So it's difficult to say now whether this was just a hollow threat or whether there are other considerations. People had been saying that they were waiting for the outcome of the Israeli elections to see if they were going to implement this. The elections have come and gone, and there still hasn't been implementation on the ground. So my worry is that this was a statement that's not going to go any further than a statement.
Well, with statements like this, I believe the media was most able and strong and powerful medium that we can actually use to make sure these actual statements are implemented. How did the media react to this announcement?
Well, there was a lot of coverage of the statement, and I think that should put pressure on the PLO and the PA that, look, the whole world paid attention to this statement. It's a really important statement, so you need to implement this. You're going to be held accountable by the statements that you make. And so far, we haven't seen that implementation. There is now speculation, for example, because Israel released Palestinian tax money to the PA, that maybe the PA must have given things up in return for this money. Maybe that was to not implement a cut in security coordination. It's difficult to say, but at the moment I find the lack of implementation so far inexplicable. If you're going to make such a bold statement, then follow through on that.
Of course, we would want them to follow through, but then has the PLO actually stated stuff like this previously, that we can actually say this is just a hello threat?
No, I mean this was an unprecedented statement. There were many threats in the past to cut security coordination, but to actually state that that's what they were going to do, that took it to another level, and that's what made it very important. There were always people from the beginning, given all these past threats, that this would lead nowhere. And so far, unfortunately, those people are being vindicated because nothing has happened so far.
But then how is Israel going to react to the situation, do you think, if it actually was implemented?
Well, Israel reacted angrily to the statement, but I think Israel would be extremely worried because security coordination has been a major tool of Israel's ability to keep control of the Palestinians. It has a reliable partner that keeps control of its own people. If it loses that, then it becomes chaos, and Israel doesn't have...
Chaos in what sense?
Well, that Israel now will then have to come back and manage the occupation itself rather than having the PA do it. And it doesn't know who would take the PA's place. I mean, there wouldn't be, for instance, a single alternative. There would be literally lots of different factions and institutions that might come up. It would be a much more complicated scenario to manage. Whereas right now, Israel has one institution, the PA, that manages these problems for it. So whatever Israel says, however angry it is, whatever threats it makes, it does not want the disintegration of the PA because the PA serves Israeli interests.
But then if the PA was to actually implement it, wouldn't they still be getting the power that they actually originally want? And then they'll just be creating a bigger headache for the Israelis, meaning that they're still benefiting from the whole situation.
Well, one of the reasons why people are skeptical that this will be implemented is because if the PA truly cuts security coordination with Israel, then Israel doesn't have anymore the need for the Palestinian Authority, because it's the security coordination that allows Israel to keep its control. If the PA cuts that control, Israel then doesn't need to keep sustaining the PA, and that would involve the PA's dissolution. And whatever the PA officials threaten about, we're going to dissolve, the situation is untenable, and they never dissolve, because they also want their self-preservation. So this is what leads people to the cynicism that maybe this is just an empty threat, because the PA wants to maintain itself, Israel wants to maintain the PA. So in terms of both sides, they are going to continue that coordination. Whatever statements they make on the ground, it will continue as is.
But doesn't that make the PA look really bad in the sense that they're just threatening for the sake of threatening?
Oh, the PA looks awful. I mean, but unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority is supported regionally and internationally as the only viable representative for the Palestinian
internationally
movement.
In what sense? Sorry, before.
Well, the Palestinian Authority is recognized by the West, internationally by the Quartet, by the UN, as the body which would be leading the Palestinians on the ground to some kind of statehood.
Even though they know that the PA and the Israeli government are actually working together to ensure the Palestinians are working and doing what the Israelis want.
Well, tragically, this is how the PA gains its international legitimacy, because it's seen as moderate. It is seen as
following the Israeli guide.
Well, that it's because it's willing to work with Israel. It's not seen as intransigent, as stubborn. So this is what adds to its legitimacy. Its very subservience is what gives it its legitimacy, and that is how we end up with such a grotesque situation, where the international community places faith on an institution that is actually betraying its goals, which is to serve its own people.
But then as the PA knows that it's recognized by all these different countries, shouldn't it actually do something different and help its actual people as it's recognized?
The problem there, and if we look simply in terms of the PA's self-preservation, is once it takes a harder line, then it loses a lot of that kind of recognition from international governments and institutions.
I'm not saying to attack the Israeli government, but to actually do something for its own people. Because from what we know,
yeah, but this is what I'm saying. If the PA decides now to stand up more for its own people's interests than for Israel's interests, then it will be portrayed as this rejectionist movement that is no different from Hamas, for instance, in terms of intransigence towards Israel and wanting the destruction of Israel. And then once it is deemed intransigent like that, then it doesn't serve its purpose anymore. For example, once Israel decided that it no longer had a use for Yasser Arafat, who was very subservient for much of his time as head of the PA, then they besieged him in the compound and then in the end poisoned him. So once their usefulness is over, then they are treated just like anyone else. So I think that the PA and Mahmoud Abbas in particular is very aware that suddenly if Mahmoud Abbas grew a spine, he might end up exactly like Yasser Arafat did.
So he's actually afraid for his own life.
Well, they owe their position to the blessing of Israel and to unfortunately to many in the international community.
So why would they announce the threat then?
Because, well, perhaps they were hoping that this would result in some Israeli concession, that either it might influence the outcome of the elections, or that it would encourage Israel to get back to the negotiating table. I mean, it could be anything, but it would be to get some kind of...
You were saying that the PA is not willing to actually help its own people because it's afraid of what's actually going to happen between them and between the Israeli government. But weren't they afraid of saying such a statement? Because that is literally against the Israeli government.
They may have been
itself.
calculating that making a bold statement like that without implementing it serves both purposes of giving their own people the sense that they are finally standing up to Israel, but then giving like a wink to Israel and saying, look, it's not really going to happen.
Yeah.
So this is the only way I can think that the logic is that they were trying to cover both bases by showing that they are standing up for the Palestinians without actually really jeopardizing the relationship with Israel. So, this is speculation. They're obviously not going to come out and say that that's the case. But and then also we don't know, for example, whether there is currently some kind of friction between the PA and the PLO. If there is resistance from Mahmoud Abbas to implementing these decisions, those if there are divisions, they are not going to be out in the public. They're going to be internal. So at the moment, it's speculative about what's going on.
What's the situation with the International Criminal Court? Is the Palestinian Authority actually willing to take the situation that's actually happened in Palestine to the courts?
Yeah, they have now very belatedly decided to apply. They applied to the court. The court accepted the application, and there is going to be an investigation. But this is going to take years. I mean, these investigations take a very long time, and in the meantime, so much can happen on the ground that will adversely affect the Palestinians that I think the ICC should be pursued, but in tandem with other avenues that will improve potentially the situation for Palestinians on the ground in the meantime. So, national liberation must be a multi-pronged approach. So you can approach the ICC as a kind of longer term avenue. Also, support the BDS movement. Garner grassroots support internationally, media activism. There are so many things that can happen in tandem. Some are more short term, some are more long term, but they should be seen as an overall package to deliver national aspirations for the Palestinians.
When we speak about Palestine, you said that Mahmoud Abbas isn't actually, he's seen in the eyes of the international world as a good person in the sense that he's actually going by the guidelines of the Israelis. So if Europe, for example, was to boycott Israel, is that going to change anything? Are they actually going to...
Massively. I mean, we're talking here in terms of boycotting, a European boycott. This would be boycotts from institutions, from companies. I mean, we're not going to it's not on the horizon that European governments will boycott Israel, but you don't need governments to boycott Israel. The EU is the biggest trading partner of Israel. So actually what governments do is irrelevant in terms of of Israel's economic health. If companies, if banks, if institutions decide to boycott, that's where it hits Israel really hard. And Israel's last finance minister was very vocal about this, about the impact that this would have. So Israel's economy, this is where it's soft underbelly, if you will. That it has certain partners that it trades with that is very reliant on its economic health, and if you have effective boycott movements from those areas, then that will have a great effect. And you have seen great strides, particularly in Europe. And if you think of Europe, Europe was traditionally an area where Israel enjoyed good relations, and at the moment, even though that's still the case largely with the governments, you know, it is losing the PR battle among the people and among institutions. And I think as the BDS movement has increased in its achievements and in its confidence, more and more companies and institutions are being emboldened to boycott Israel without this fear of repercussion, that more and more people are doing it. Because frankly, people are seeing that you know, what Israel is doing, like it can't go on. And this is of Israel's doing. Israel is showing people in Europe and elsewhere that you know, it can no longer be trusted or defended. This is Israel's doing more than anything really that Palestinian activism have achieved. It is Israel's own intransigence, its arrogance, and its aggression.
Yeah, as we know, there are many different applications that someone can use on their phone just to know where the product is actually from, so they can buy different other products. But the thing is, there are so many companies that actually work hand in hand with Israel that the majority of us citizens are not sure of. And even if we are to use the application, we're still not 100% sure if it's Israeli or not.
Yeah.
So even though the financial minister of Israel said that the economy isn't actually doing well because of the boycotting, how come Netanyahu still continued to speak negatively about the Palestinians, saying that they're not going to be giving a state?
I mean, to clarify, the Israeli statements about the effect of the boycott, these are saying, you know, that this is what could happen to the Israeli economy. I don't think we're there yet in terms of the level of BDS. But, you know, I think people like Netanyahu become drunk on their own power and their own arrogance, and they feel that whatever happens, as long as they have the support of certain governments, that they can get away with what they're doing. But what they don't realize is that, you know, the more that it relies on support simply on the governmental level while alienating different publics, you're creating a disconnect that can't go on indefinitely. I mean, for instance, in Europe, European governments until now do not reflect the level of public opinion towards Israel. But that can't go on forever. These are elected governments. You know, you're going to get to a stage where there is so much anger towards what Israel does. The governments are going to have to pay attention. So I think Israel is just like with any power that achieves a certain level of strength simply by military might. They think that that's the only way that they are going to maintain that power. And I think that's where people like Netanyahu are help the Palestinian cause, because they are so blinkered that we must respond by force. Force is the only way that we can achieve our objectives. That they are so insistent on this that they don't see how they are alienating the rest of the world and isolating themselves. And whatever Israel says about, oh well, we don't need the world, we can stand up for ourselves. Well, no, actually, you are pretty dependent on America and Europe. Really, you are very much dependent on them. So it does matter what other people around the world think.
But then, should we be afraid or be cautious of, if we're to boycott a lot, is that going to affect the Palestinians themselves? Is Israel going to find another reason to oppress them more?
Well, this is one of the arguments that you know Israel says, and this is a typical colonialist attitude that, oh, if you boycott our products, you know, we have Palestinian employees, they are farmers, they work in our factories, you're going to affect them too. But the problem is that Israel is economically strangling Palestinians. They are making Palestinians dependent on Israel for their employment, for their livelihoods. And what Israel wants is the continuation of that process. If you challenge that very system, then you're not disenfranchising Palestinians. You're freeing them from this forced subservience that they have to work for Israelis in terms of making a living. That's not a justification for maintaining the status quo. That's justifying enslavement. So the reason for the boycott movement is to free these people, not to harm Palestinians. It's to so that they can employ themselves, so that they can run their own companies, and they can literally be free from all these forms of Israeli oppression.
What's the role of the UN?
It doesn't really have one. I mean, if you look at the quartet, for example, the UN is just one of different parties from the quartet. You have the EU, the US, Russia, and the UN. So the UN has been relegated to just one kind of player. And unfortunately, it's completely irrelevant, because you have the US veto in the Security Council means that nothing is done about Israel. There are no resolutions that are even mildly critical of Israel anymore in the Security Council. The US vetoes them. So the UN is becoming irrelevant in terms of the conflict, because the only institution within the UN that has the greatest potential leverage over the conflict is hamstrung by this US veto, it's a knee-jerk automatic veto. So I think the UN has really failed the Palestinian people, and all it comes up with now are just these generic statements of both sides, and it's simply in terms of it's by focusing only on humanitarian efforts, for instance, in terms of trying to rebuild Gaza, you're sticking a small plaster on a massive wound. You are not dealing with the underlying injustices that cause these problems. So unfortunately, the UN has failed the people, and as long as the Security Council is the way it is, then Palestinians can't expect any kind of reprieve from the council itself.
As the Security Council and the UN are nothing to Palestine and are no help to Palestine, can we actually be hopeful then of the International Criminal Court?
Well, the UN is what I said is the UN is only helpful on a humanitarian level. Even then, it's not enough. But even on the level that it does, I mean, humanitarian efforts on their own do not solve the problem. Mm-hmm. You know, you need to address the causes of these humanitarian problems. So, no, I think the ICC the ICC doesn't have a body within it like the Security Council, where one country can say, no, this isn't happening because I don't want it to happen. So I think the ICC does have more potential to act than the Security Council does. I think what's been quite heartening is that after the ICC accepted the Palestinian application, there were efforts by Israel and the US to convince the ICC's biggest donors to cut their funds to the ICC, and those major donors refused. So I think that was quite important. So for now, at least, that showed that the ICC is going to continue and has resisted so far the pressures from Israel and the US to cut funding. I think that those kind of pressures might increase, but also the ICC is not only dealing with the issue of Palestine. So this is another reason why these donors, some of whom are allies of Israel and the US, they won't do it, because that means that all these other investigations are going to, the ICC as an institution is an important institution. So they're not going to risk that very institution crumbling just because of one case.
But then if they're actually two states, and it'll be very weird if they don't actually recognize Israel as a criminal government or a country because of what it's actually done. But if it does recognize it as criminal, what is actually going to happen to Israel? What's the situation?
Well, okay, so the ICC cannot force Israel to comply with its ruling. There's no implementational measure. But as I said earlier, this adds a powerful tool to the Palestinian movement and the pro-Palestinian movement of achieving their national rights. It hurts Israel's PR, which is already in a pretty disastrous situation as is. So this further isolates Israel. It delegitimizes its narrative. So it should be seen as part of this bigger movement of of making people see that Israel is acting like a rogue state, that it's a pariah state. People do rightly say, well, okay, whatever ruling comes out of it, that it's, for instance, the International Court of Justice, its ruling on the wall, it was very damning against Israel, but nothing happened. But you keep having these developments and these rulings that add to the case against Israel. I think that's where it's important.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us on the show again. And thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.